The other piece was Railroad Bill.
There you go.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay, there we go. Audio wasn't working, of course. Always fuck things up. I always take like like as I was saying, I always take like a bite of something really dry right before I'm supposed to start. In this case, it was a cream cracker, and I was just like, I can't speak, and then my microphone wasn't working. I should probably test these things before I start. Next time, what are you gonna do? Um, this says it. Nope. This fucking Christ, why can't I do that? Other way. There we go. This says it all, doesn't it, everybody? The snakes are indeed alive. For those of you who give a fuck, the small crossover of people who care about communism and also the World Series and also the Arizona Diamondbacks, which I'll admit I didn't up until like last week. The Diamondbacks, that is. Well, here you go. The snakes are indeed alive. Well done, snakes. They crushed Texas last night, which is very cool. Tied it up 1-1. I was really pissed off when they beat the Dodgers. Not so much because I don't like the Diamondbacks, more so just because, like, as a Dodger fan, I was like, is this really fucking happening again? Are we really going to have an incredible 100-plus win season again and then get knocked out in the playoffs by a divisional rival? It did happen. Dodgers did not win a game, so it was worse than it was last year when the Padres beat us. Because at least we won one game last year. But this year, not even winning one. Mookie Betts, his batting average begins and ends with a 0 in the postseason this year. And there's also a 0 in the middle, which is to say he didn't get a hit. Anyway, enough Dodgers complaining. I'm all in on these snakes. Partially because of this sign, partially because of their manager, Torey Lovello. He's hilarious. his like speech in the locker room when they beat the Phillies, or maybe it was when they beat the Dodgers. He was just like, I don't know what's going on. I don't know how we've done this. Let's get fucked up. And they all just like showered him with booze. So good for them. We'll get rid of that. We'll talk about some actual stuff here. Where do I want to start? I think what I'll start with is a spreadsheet that I made because I'm an asshole. Let me get rid of this. Do I do that? Just that? Yeah, there we go. So, going off our last stream, if you watch that one, you know that I've been getting through Isaac Rubin's essays on Marxist theories of value, which is really, really good. And I really appreciate it because at one point he just comes out and is like, value theory is fucking complicated. You know what I mean? It's hard to understand and difficult to, wrap your head around. And I really appreciate that because I feel like whenever I try and talk about value with like any socialist, they're just like, it's so simple. And then they just, hit you with like 500 pages of esoteric text. And it's just like, I don't understand what any of this means. And as someone that hasn't studied any of this stuff, like in school officially, yeah, it's difficult to understand. I'll just come right out and fucking say it. And I've been doing my best recently. So we're not going to talk about what else I've read from Rubin's book since last stream, just because I think I'd like to read a little bit more before we get back into it. But I think what I wanted to share with everybody today and what the fuck this spreadsheet actually is I've been kind of trying to come to kind of like write down a lot of the arguments that you kind of need to start with when you talk about value theory, because there's always been like a bit of a nagging thing in the back of my head that's like, could this all not just be like completely subjective? Is this all just crazy? Like, what is the thing that makes it so that it isn't what the kind of like, more liberal like economists, well, just like everybody that isn't a Marxist would say, which is just like prices are just determined by supply and demand. There's no third thing that's being compared. Get over it. It's all subjective. And I've really been trying to write down all the different arguments that I come across for why that stuff is. And this first one up here, I'll zoom in, is, as far as I can tell, what I got from reading Capital. And of course, this is not all that's in Capital. This is basically just the kind of the third thing argument summed up in the first few chapters. And I didn't realize, I'll zoom in on this in just a sec, but that's this argument. And then there's a lot of stuff, I didn't realize this, but I think there's a lot of stuff that Marx assumes in those chapters that you already know about the division of labor and about the universality of labor and commensurability that he just doesn't even begin with. So I think that's what I was missing recently. I was on the value theory and chill Discord, and I found a really good, it wasn't a thread, it was just something that somebody wrote up. Value theory and chill Discord, by the way, just disappeared. Don't know what the deal with that is. That kind of sucks. I saved the stuff I really liked off of it, so thank God I did that. But somebody on there had written up a thing called the Chapter 0 of Capital, which is basically like the stuff that Marx assumes you already know. And that's kind of what this is. And then finally, I wasn't very satisfied with those. The Chapter 0 stuff is really kind of exactly what I was missing in terms of the third thing argument about why it isn't all just subjective, right? And so that was hugely illuminating. But then finally there's this, which is kind of the line of thinking that I've kind of just put together about value and where it comes from and all this stuff. It doesn't really make a bunch of sense being all zoomed out, so let's zoom in and I'll show you what I'm talking about. So this first one, can I go in a little bit more? That seems too much. There, yeah, that's fine, whatever. So we're just going to talk about this top one up here, and this is what I got from reading Marx's Capital, and it's basically the third thing argument. Again, I will just come out and say I have not studied this stuff professionally before. Does that make sense? At an academy, at anything like that. So if I get stuff wrong, fucking tell me. I would really appreciate it. But the first step in the kind of the third thing argument is that because all of these commodities on a market are being exchanged with each other, there must be some kind of commensurable quality common to all of them that's being compared, right? So this is kind of the Kleinman essay about the third thing, and it's like, okay, because through the medium of money, because, when you go to the market, you're like exchanging your pumpkins that you grew, I guess, with, you sell that to get some socks if you own like a pumpkin farm or something like that. And then, you sell that for money, and then you go back, you go to the market, and you get what you need, which in this shitty example is socks. Because they're all kind of like being compared on the market, there must be some kind of third thing in there. And this different step in that argument is that third thing can't be use values, right? Because the whole point of exchange is that you're exchanging things that are different, right? So it can't just be like the concrete, like material use value of a thing. And it can't be concrete labor time, right? And so Marx basically comes out and says that it must be labor in the abstract, must be abstract labor. And I always kind of was like, okay, yeah, that makes sense. But also, like, why is this a necessity? I don't really know what I was talking about here. I read this down like 2 weeks ago and I already forgot. I think this was just something that I wrote up just to be like, oh, yeah, and by the way, value makes it impossible to compare like with like. I don't know what I meant by like with like. I think 1 hour of labor with 1 hour of labor, so maybe concrete labor. Ensuring expanding value ensures expanding production and accumulation is the goal, and it alienates workers from their labor. I think I would go back and rewrite this and just, oh, I didn't know that was going to highlight. I would just say that, well, whatever, fucking who cares. I would say that private labor is the thing that, the kind of capitalist form of private property is the thing that alienates workers from their labor. Anyway, I wasn't particularly happy with that one, so I went through the chapter 0 of capital stuff, and I kind of wrote that into a little flow chart here. And the chapter 0 stuff kind of begins with the basic building blocks, whereas the argument up here kind of doesn't. It assumes you already know some things. And one of those things is the division of labor, right? And this is kind of, I guess, already in, it's not in Capital because it's in The Wealth of Nations. And Marx was just like, anyone who's reading this will surely have read Wealth of Nations. I don't know about that. And I don't know if that will ever be the case for me. So anyway, the division of labor, the first logical step in all of this is because labor is divided into specializations, labor productivity goes up, but private labor can no longer cover everyone's individual needs, right? That's fairly obvious. If, labor under the kind of like picture in the mind's eye that we have of feudalism, you made all your shirts in your house or whatever, and you kind of exchanged very infrequently when you went to towns. Once labor gets divided up into specializations, well, that kind of home labor can no longer cover everything, right? And there's some different ways of thinking about this, but then eventually you get to exchange, because given a division of labor and private property, exchange is now necessary to cover all individual needs, right? And this sentence cracks me up. I don't know why I wrote it like this. A carpenter needs a farmer to eat. A carpenter needs a farmer to eat. They're not eating the farmer, right? So then logically from there you get the universality of labor, which is another step that I don't think you can really, I don't know, it's not so much in Capital, because again, this is just something that you're maybe supposed to assume. It is in Capital, but it's also not at the very beginning, right? Like, because all workers are free to choose, free, right? I put that in quotes for a reason, where they work. Labor takes on a homogeneous character. And this is kind of hard to wrap your head around, because it doesn't really seem like there's a very homogeneous, character of labor. Like, there are very few things that I could actually just go and do, given my, like, knowledge and experience. Those things are, like, work in a warehouse, work in a pub, or do, like, low-level university administration, you know what I mean? But realistically, like, capitalism doesn't really give a fuck. As long as you can kind of be trained to do your job, it doesn't matter if you're, like, the son of a noble or whatever. Like, just plug in some schmuck, they can go and do it. That's what is kind of meant by the universality of labor. And then, because of the necessity of exchange and the universality of labor, labor becomes necessarily commensurable. No one will exchange more than they have received in a commensurable exchange by choice. I put by choice because obviously this happens all the time. It's not like individual capitalists know the socially necessary labor time of any individual product. They're kind of just guessing out there, right? But, but since both sides of exchange are running that comparison, we obtain, and this is directly from the Discord, since both sides of the exchange are running that comparison, we obtain a convergence towards a middle ground. This middle ground, labor in the abstract or socially necessary labor time, I suppose, which optimize for both people's subjective evaluation of how much labor they are giving away and how much they obtain in exchange. So that's like the chapter 0 stuff, and that is supposed to be logical steps that just get you to why value exists in capitalism and why it's a necessity for exchange, right? So this last one I put together is kind of a bit more inspired by the councilist stuff. And I think this is just where I'm going to fucking leave it, because I think this is about as in-depth as you need to go to speak to regular human beings, which is supposed to be the point of all of this. And it's set up slightly different. So it's these two things together give you this, and then there's a couple like different explainers. We'll get to what those are here in a sec. And what these two things are basically private ownership, private property, that is, private ownership of the means of production, plus production for exchange gives you the necessity of value, right? So just to go into a bit more detail, private ownership of the means of production, which is not a legal category, right? It is a social relation. And when we talk about the fundamental principles here in a sec, that's what we'll see. It denotes exclusive, separate private labor production processes, right? So like firms, companies, that kind of thing, you know what I mean? In addition to that, once you have that and you have production predominantly happening for the purposes of exchange, only under those circumstances does human labor constitute value and products constitute commodities. Exchange of private products must use value as a measure when they're being exchanged, right? And so why is that? Well, because all economies require a basis and a measure for production and distribution. This kind of is obvious. They need to be comparing their products in some way so that it's not just completely arbitrary. Though private property excludes the use of direct labor time as a measure. And for socialism, that's kind of what we're aiming for. We're kind of aiming to be able to use 1 hour of labor is the thing that you then use as the means of consumption, right? So then why does that happen? And then this is the last kind of little logical step that I put forward. Because firms are rewarded for their productivity. Sellers will want to get the most for their productivity and buyers will want the least, right? Sellers selling products made above Sellers selling products made above average productivity will edge towards socially necessary labor time of the product, and buyers will not buy products made below average productivity at the same price. That's a very wordy way of saying if you go to the shop to buy socks and somebody's trying to sell them for $40 million, you're going to be like, I'm probably not going to buy that, right? So they're all kind of floating around this average level of things. Its value kind of acts as this disciplining agent behind the backs of producers and workers, like, you know, behind the backs of workers and capitalists, I should say, right? That basically forces them to sell things for their socially necessary labor time. I'm not going to get into the transformation problem stuff here, but basically, I said that because of this kind of logical 3-step thing here, socialism must find a way to use direct labor time as a comparative measure while maintaining high productivity. And this is kind of the important bit here, because I think when we go through the fundamental principles stuff, like people will be like, well, this is fucking stupid. This is just going to be the least productive system on the planet, which I think is a fair objection if you haven't read the fundamental principles stuff to see what they're talking about. So that's what we're going to talk about. This is all very wordy, kind of like drawn out way of me trying to show my like logical steps here to try and figure out why value kind of like is at the center of capitalist production. Because unless you kind of like are coming to a lot of this, like the chapter 0 stuff with kind of a lot of this information because you studied it at school or something like that, it's really difficult, at least for me, to make it make sense. And I think that the only thing, well, I should say the simplest explanation for value that I've found is this one down here, right? And it is the given private ownership of the means of production, which is to say private property, and production happening predominantly for the purpose of exchange, which is to say basically just for exchange. Only in those circumstances does human labor constitute value, and exchange of private products must use their value as a measure. Okay? So, I don't know how helpful that was for anybody. This is just kind of the way my brain works. I needed to kind of like get all of these different arguments down on paper and hopefully have them make sense. But having said that, let's get to the fundamental principles, baby. I'm going to get rid of that again. So, I've been doing a lot of thinking recently. I mentioned this on the last stream, when I was at the anarchist book fair, zine fair kind of thing in London a couple weeks ago now at this point. I came across the Christicuffs table, and a listener had sent us an email to the show basically saying you should check out Christicuffs because they're really good at explaining these ideas of value in a way that makes sense to your average dumb idiot. And I was like, oh, cool, I should take a look at that. And one of the things I got from them was a companion to David Harvey's Companion to Marx's Capital. And since the last stream, I've actually read through it, and they do a really, really good job of kind of not just elucidating like the issues with David Harvey's Companion to Capital, of which there are many, but explaining it in a way that, you know, your average schmuck can understand. And that's something that I'm really interested in because, again, that's supposed to be the whole point of this stuff, right? Is to explain it to people and to get people to understand. It's to get to the core of like the scientific nature of the kind of like underlying functioning of a capitalist society. You need to do that first, but then it's about getting these ideas out there in kind of a digestible way. So I went back to the fundamental principles just because it's been on my mind a lot recently for whatever reason. We have episode 100 coming up, and I think I've been kind of thinking about different things that we could do for episode 100, and I was thinking about maybe just returning to this book because it fucking rocks and doesn't get talked about nearly enough. But, you know, we'll see. Suffice it to say, that's why I've been thinking about it a lot. And I found in there, I remembered in chapter 6, there's like a really good, I think, what is it, 3 pages? Yeah, it's a 3-page description of the capitalist social production process. It's called the social production process in general. And it's kind of exactly what I'd been looking for, which is just a really good way of summarizing capitalist production really succinctly and in a way that is eminently understandable to everybody, because that's the whole point. I got where is it? There's a book up there somewhere. I'm not gonna find it. There's a book that Cosmonaut actually published a while ago, or I should say that they republished a like edited version called Shop Talks on Economics. This is kind of a similar thing. It's like a really good explanation of value and of capitalism, specifically written for normal people, right? And you know, call me crazy, but I do think that there need to be more of those out there. And I was really impressed by chapter 6 of the fundamental principles, partially because their writing style is just so fucking funny. Like, I don't know if they meant it to be. I don't know if this is just like a German thing or a Dutch thing. German people and Dutch people are just incredibly funny. I mean that in the best possible way. But like the way that they write is just so good. It's like, it's eminently understandable, and it's also very funny. Like when they talk about Kautsky, it's just like they're like a step away from just being like, this guy was a fucking moron. So anyway, one thing I wanted to do on stream is to go through this section, this chapter, and just kind of revisit it, return to it, because it is really, really good, and it's not something that I was kind of like... When we were reading it for the show, I was kind of just reading it to understand their proposals. And I'm really glad to return to it now and kind of really understand their writing style, right? And understand what makes it so understandable. So we'll just go through it. It's 3 pages. I think we just read the whole thing. And then there are a couple of other things I want to get to, including part of a listener email. And then something that I came across in the library today, which was a speech that was given by, of all people, Trotsky, which I think was actually very good. And I think could warrant some revisiting, I think, for reasons that we'll see here in a bit. So we'll get through this. Maybe we'll get to a little bit of why the fundamental principle stuff abolishes these 2 things, private property and production for exchange, which is what you need to be doing if you're looking to create socialism. And then we'll get to all those other things. So if you're with me, I have to say we just kind of just go through this entire chapter. So the first section is called Production and Reproduction. And it's basically just a way of telling people, hey, there's an entire social production process that we are all part of, no matter what you do. And its purpose is to give us the things that we need to survive, right? Which I think is obviously like a good starting point for people that have no idea what you're talking about when you talk about Marxism or, you know, exchange value or anything like this, socially necessary labor time. People who just look at, normal people who look at you like, what the fuck is this person talking about? This is a really good place to start, because a lot of people just kind of take it for granted. So they say, through its production apparatus, humanity has created an organ to meet its diverse needs. With the help of machines and tools, human labor fights against nature in order to distribute a stream of labor products over the earth using natural raw materials. The working process is called the production process. This, I think if you were to talk about this with, kind of say this to normal people, it would come across as a bit like, what's the word? Not pedantic, but like, oh, and then you take these things and you work with them. It's like, yeah, duh, no shit. But it is like, logically, you do kind of need to start here. This working process is called the production process. It not only produces goods, but also absorbs many machines and tools as well as the labor itself. From this point of view, the production process is at the time of demolition, of destruction. Oh, that's cool. That actually has cool ecological, I don't know, implications that I didn't really notice the first time I went through this book. Interesting. But at the same time, we create new values in this process of destruction. Machines, tools, and our labor are consumed, but at the same time, renewed, restored, and reproduced. And this is kind of their whole thing, right? Like, you need to understand that this is all a process of reproduction. The social production process runs like the life process in the human body, through the self-destruction to self-construction in a continuously more complicated form. And then they quote Marx here. I think this is from the first volume of Capital. Yep. Whatever the form of the process of production in a society, it must be a continuous process, must continue to go periodically through the same phases, when viewed, therefore, as a connected whole, as flowing on with incessant renewal. Every social process of production is, at the same time, a process of reproduction. And so, you know, it's just a couple paragraphs, but they're just making the point that, like, you know, this production process that we're all part of, no matter what you do, it's an ongoing dynamic thing, and we are constantly reproducing ourselves, right? This fits very well with, I think, a lot of systems theory stuff. And then they get into capitalist production, right? So they say it's precisely in the laws of this movement, of this constant renewal, in the laws of movement of reproduction, that capitalism presents itself as an uncontrolled and revolutionary system. It knows no standstill. It is constantly pulled from its old foundations to find a new balance at a higher level and with a higher capacity. It must create more and more and bigger companies. It must reproduce production on an ever larger scale, or to put it capitalistically, capital must accumulate constantly. So I think that when you are writing for, like, normal people, you kind of need to, they're hitting all of the points that you need to make. You need to make it known that what you're doing when you get up and go to work every day is, you know, you're being part of a reproduction process, a societal wide reproduction process in which society as we know it now is reproducing itself, right? No matter what you do. Then you got to hit on the second beat, which is, here's the way that capitalism does this. And then you got to hit on the third beat, which is, here's how capitalism fucks it all up. And then finally, the fourth beat is what they will wind up going to in the next chapter. Here's how we can do it better without fucking everything up, right? Because the profitability of capital is the purpose of capitalist production, and therefore profit is the driving force. Therefore, profit is the driving force. Now they're hitting on the beat, which is about here's how everything gets fucked up. And because only the living labor force can generate surplus value, every capitalist must strive to employ as many workers as possible. That is, to produce as much as possible. Okay, so I mean, from ecological, like an ecological standpoint, you can already see how that's going to fuck everything up. I think maybe if you're writing this today, you would really want to put something like that in. But they're just obviously here to show how the production process just doesn't really make sense from kind of just like a very labor-centric standpoint, which also is something that you need to explain to people. In this quest for profit, the various business groups face each other. Each group wants to secure as much as possible of the surplus value that is squeezed out of the working class. So now they're setting up the kind of like dichotomy, obviously, between workers and bosses, which is another thing you need to do. The hunt for the prey becomes a mutual battle for the prey, or to put it simply, they compete against each other. This fight for prey is the great revolutionary. I think that was a weird translation. The great revolutionary in production. Every company has to be prepared to produce cheaper than its competitors, so that the pursuit of profit means the pursuit of technological improvements, and ever newer labor-saving machines have to replace the old ones. If a company, for example, in the steel industry succeeds in finding a new, cheaper production method, this company will have reduced the value of the capital of all its competitors. The other capitals are obsolete, blah, 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 moral wear and tear. I don't know if you necessarily need to put that kind of in when you're just talking about, like, an explanation of the basics of the capitalist economy, but kind of for their purposes here, I do kind of understand what they're doing. And then the last paragraph of the entire chapter is, it goes beyond the scope of our considerations to address the immense waste of social goods, as well as the crisis and other disasters that the struggle for prey entails. I do like how they call it prey in here. For our subject, it is only important to point out that the constant renewal, the reproduction of the tools, is an individual function of the capitalists. It is up to them to decide whether and to what extent it will be renewed, not, of course, by taking the needs of the people as a guide, but by concentrating on the profit opportunities offered by the struggle for prey at this moment. So I think that's just a really, really well-written chapter on the social production process of capitalism. And I think that it's kind of eminently, most of it is eminently understandable by anybody that is remotely disaffected by capitalism, right? And I think just in terms of writing, it's just a really interesting little couple paragraphs to study, because again, there are certain things that you need to set up whenever you're writing for a popular audience. And I think in this chapter, they hit on all of them kind of really well. Because a lot of times people will overwrite and will start talking about, well, have you considered exchange versus use value? Have you considered this? Ooh, have you considered this spreadsheet that the madman made that explains nothing? And I think that really all you need to explain when you're writing for a popular audience is we're all part of a process of reproduction. Capitalism fucks it all up. Here's what you can do about it, and here's the next steps, right? And they do that really, really well. It's very funny. It's very good. I've been thinking about, like, how, I don't know, I do think that people should try and set up maybe as, instead of capital reading groups that very often people will leave and not want to be a part of anymore because Capital is like a very maddening book to try and read, even if you're doing it in a group. I do think doing fundamental principles reading groups, there are worse ideas to have. And I mean, obviously there's a lot of stuff in this book that is like not going to be of interest to most people. All of the chapters where they talk about Kautsky and they talk about, like, I don't know, what else is in here? Like kind of all the different sectarian stuff is, I think, a bit not of interest to your average person. I think if you can kind of sum it up as, here's the problems of social democracy, here's the problems of anarchism, now let's get into actually talking about capitalism and a positive proposal for the future, that would probably be better. But again, I mean, I think next time anyone's thinking about doing capital reading groups with their friends or with their, you know, co-activists or whatever, I don't know, maybe consider this, because there's a lot of stuff in here that, like, liberals will be able to understand, you know what I mean? And not even liberals, just people that aren't necessarily very politically inclined. So what are you gonna do? Anyway, I would like to talk a little bit about the next chapter as well, just because, again, I've really been trying to come back to this book now that I've been reading, well, I was going to say more about value, but like anything about value at all, and kind of since I've finished Capital, because I am seeing it in kind of a slightly different light. It's funny because after all of the different steps, you know, reading through the third thing arguments and the chapter 0 of Capital stuff, like I have just kind of come back to like, well, okay, you know, that's all well and good, but like really all you need is this stuff here at the bottom, which is literally just like, okay, capitalism, it's private ownership of the means of production, it's production for exchange, that gives you value, how do you actually get rid of value? Because like then you can kind of just talk with anybody about, you know, the different objections that come up when you talk about capital or communism with normal people, right? Because inevitably people are going to be talking about fundamental principles. Let's go. What's up, Donal? I figured you would probably be excited about someone talking about fundamental principles out there somewhere. Actually, you know what, Donal? I've been listening to re-listening to your and Tom's episode on that LL Men book. I've got to not find a copy, but actually make an effort to read it. I fucking hate trying to read PDFs, so I might try and take Tom's PDF that he posted in the show notes and try and get it printed somewhere. That book seems very good. But getting back to it, now that I'm kind of like revisiting the fundamental principles after kind of reading anything about value at all, I've been kind of trying to reread it with an eye towards, okay, how is it like getting past these two categories? How is it getting past private ownership, which is to say private property, private ownership for the means of production? How is it getting past production for exchange? Because like, if you just keep those two categories in your mind, like when you're talking to normal people about communism and you inevitably get the like, well, communism, it doesn't work, right? The Soviet Union's not around anymore. You can like really easily just apply this definition of capitalism to that and be like, yeah, they didn't fucking get rid of, you know, private ownership of the means of production. And you can kind of get into why people will be like, well, they kind of did and they kind of didn't. I mean, like, they weren't capitalist, right? But you can just be like, yeah, but so what? It was just like everything was owned. They had money for a reason. Everything was owned by the state. And that doesn't actually get rid of the alienation of labor just because workers had slightly more power in the Soviet Union, right? Like, you know, it doesn't actually get rid of private property. So I think when I'm talking to normal people about capitalism and about definitions of capitalism and stuff like that, I'm just going to be keeping these two things in mind, which is just always relate it back to private property, always relate it back to production for exchange. And like I said, that's how I'm kind of now revisiting the fundamental principles to see how it is that they actually get past those two things. Because honestly, like, I don't know, most proposals, such as there really are any, amongst Marxist sects for communism, most positive proposals, literally just amount to like, you know, yeah, I don't know, we'll take political power and then we'll just like start nationalizing things. And like most people's ideas are literally just they're with or whether they realize it or not, it's kind of just general cartel stuff, right? There's no real like economic understanding of how communism will operate. And I think it's kind of because most Marxists are just like scared to put forward positive proposals, which, you know, fair enough, but like that doesn't give you a right to like discount all of the good positive proposals that are out there, of which I think this is maybe the only one that actually gets rid of, you know, private property and production for exchange. But I don't know, maybe not. This is the only one that I've found so far. Maybe actually, do I want to get into this, or do I want to get into the the reason that I bring up the well, how should I start this? A while ago, Dan and I read the Mike McNair book. What's it called? Revolutionary Strategy for the show. And when we posted our final episode about it, within like 24 hours, we had gotten an email from Mike McNair, which was so funny. Like, we had never had any contact with him before. I don't know how he found out that we posted our episodes and I listened to them that quickly. But in the episodes, or in maybe one of the YouTube videos that we made about the book, we kind of criticized the CPGB's political platform because it said nothing about what socialism should actually look like beyond what I just said. We're just going to, you know, nationalize things until we get socialism. And we kind of hassled him a little bit about this when we recorded, and he sent us a long email about like, well, yeah, blah, 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 blah. I forget where the email is. I'll try and dig it out sometime. It's very funny. But basically, this is all to say that like a lot of Marxist sects now aren't actually really interested in positive proposals, and what they are interested in is kind of like a egotistical like power play, because to them communism is just taking control of the state. And it's, you know, forget about political economy, we're just thinking politics here, right? That's how you do socialism. And there's a lot of like real disingenuous behavior when it comes to different Marxist sects about like, well, we can't think about positive proposals because nobody really has any idea what this stuff is going to look like. And it's really paternalistic, and it's kind of just like gaslighting the working class, which, give credit to the working class, there's a fucking reason nobody gives a shit about these Marxist sects, and it's because they're not actually putting forward a like cool idea of communism. It's just like, we'll do what the Russians did in the Russian Revolution, except we'll make it work. And it's like, how are you going to make it work? I don't know. What are you going to do? Anyway, so let's get back into the fundamental principles, because I was really happy to see when I opened up to chapter 7, which is kind of like the, you know, opposite of chapter 6. Chapter 6 kind of tells you about the social production process and capitalism. This is the good stuff of the book. This is the one that actually gives you the communist production method, right? I was really happy to see that they take the kind of definition of capitalism of, you know, private property and production for exchange, and it's really elusive. That's like really what they're working from in this chapter. They're saying, here's how we get rid of exchange, here's how we get rid of private property, and then they get into why nobody else has done it and why they were all wrong. So I think we just get into it. They start with the transfer of goods, and they say, before we can take a closer look at the general rules of production and distribution, for a good understanding, we must first understand why communism has no exchange and no value. That's the whole point. We have seen, and then the Hassel-Hilferding again, which is very funny. Despite all of the learned books on the subject, the abolition of these categories is still hidden in the deepest darkness. But it is not especially important not to make things more difficult than they really are. The point is that you have to own something in order to exchange it. Those who have nothing, who own nothing, have nothing to trade. I think they could have phrased that a bit better, because it's like, under communism, you will own nothing. That scares people. The exchange is, therefore, not only an economic act, but rather a transfer based on private property. Exchange is, therefore, an economic act that expresses the social relationship that the products of labor are privately owned. This bit, I think, is really important, because I think that a lot of socialists assume that exchange and private property, those are just like legal categories, right? And it's just like, you know, change the laws to make it look like, you know, hey, the state owns everything. That means we all own everything. It isn't that simple, and you're not going to get rid of value if that's all that you do. The whole point that they're putting forward here is that actually this stuff is representing a social relationship, not a legal relationship, right? The social revolution, the revolution in social relations, the revolution in the mutual relations of the people of social life of operational units, abolishes this social relationship. It brings the production of labor into a common ownership. Exchange, which is a function of private property, is thus abolished. And where does this come from? This is from the Critique of the Gotha program. Because under the altered circumstances, no one can give up anything except their labor, and because, on the other hand, nothing can pass into the ownership of individuals except the individual means of consumption. Would have been a lot better if Marx phrased this, not phrased it differently, but like expanded on this, because people argue about this shit so much. But this is kind of the whole point. It's like, they'll get into this sentence here. However, the transfer of goods is not an exchange because the owners of products do not change in the flow of goods. They kind of just say that exchange under communism, it might look like exchange, but in reality, it's just a transfer, right? Whereas in capitalism, people who are, say, they own the like cotton spinning part of the production process for socks, like when they get in the cotton, they're expected to like pay money back to the other person who is selling them the cotton. But under communism, there's really just like a transfer of goods that's going on. And the whole point that the fundamental principle stuff kind of like elucidates is that you need to be keeping track of this stuff so that you can then account for it later. Under, I think, like a lot of anarchist, proposals, such as there are ones of kind of like the society of free and equal producers, it's kind of the transfer, but without the accounting. It's just like, okay, yeah, and then like, I don't know, firms will just give people, X amount of cotton to make the socks just because, like, why not? And there will be no accounting for any of it. This, I think, is the best of everything, right? It's the best of all worlds. It's like, it's the freedom of just the transfer without the exchange, but you also don't need money because you're just keeping track of the labor hours in any given product. So this is all basically to just say, I could go through all of this, but it's basically to just say they build up to the equation, wherever it is. Where is it? Yeah, which is basically just here. They go through kind of how you need to keep track of how you keep track of things in this transfer of products, right? And it's basically keep track of the machinery and buildings, the raw materials, consumables, and the labor. And then that just becomes like the total labor cost of the product. One thing, and I'm interested if anyone listening has any ideas on this, Donal, if you're still there, I would wonder kind of what you think about this. The kind of fixed capital part of this, say you're setting up a new firm, I would imagine that obviously, like, circulating capital, I would imagine, is really easy to account for in this way because it's just like we used X amount of electricity in this part of the production process today, or we used this amount of like raw materials. That's really easy to account for. But the kind of fixed capital stuff I'm kind of interested in because it's like, presumably you're talking about the upkeep of machinery and all of the buildings that you're using in a production process. But is that tacked on at the very beginning when all of these machines are like quote unquote purchased? Or is it throughout their life you're trying to come up with some kind of ratio of what the upkeep of any given machine is? I would imagine it would have to be up front in terms of purchasing a machine, or at least like implementing a new machine in any given production process. And that would just have to make like that specific time frame of those products being produced slightly more expensive. But then you could probably easily keep track of upkeep because it's like, oh, we had to replace the like thing that spins and the machine that spins things. Here's how much that cost in labor hours. I think I'm just kind of interested in how that works up at the very beginning. Like when you're setting up a new factory or when a factory has to buy a new machine, it seems like you could maybe have differences, maybe like even big differences in price. But, I don't know. That's something else I got to figure out. And basically, I don't know, I could get into a lot more of this and kind of compare it to this very large spreadsheet that I've put forward. But basically, this is the only stuff in accounting for transfer and kind of common ownership that isn't just taken under the paternalistic control of the state. This is the only proposal that I've really seen that actually does abolish private ownership of the means of production, as well as production for exchange, right? Because there's no real exchange going on here. It's just a transfer. I think I had kind of planned to talk a little bit more about this stuff, but I would like to eventually get to this. Where is it? How do I find this? Is it this? Yeah, to this Trotsky speech, which I never thought I would say, but I found this today. I think I'd like to get to this. So I'll be eventually kind of like returning to the fundamental principles stuff, I think, when I try and stream whatever the fuck I get. I'm always like, man, I'm going to try and stream once a week. That would really be good. And then it's like, oh, I actually have a life and I have shit I have to do. And it always winds up being like once every 3 weeks. But I think the more that I get into the Rubin book, and I think the more that I get into kind of like really making an effort to understand value theory and stuff like that, I would like to keep returning to the fundamental principles just to kind of like compare it to what I've like learned, I guess, if that makes sense, or kind of like, you know, what I have, yeah, I don't know, just like what I've, yeah, I guess with what I've learned when it comes to value theory, because when I kind of came to the realization of like the definition of capitalism that necessitates value, which is private property and production for exchange, I was like, oh, that actually seems to be really well accounted for in the fundamental principles and kind of like not really in anything else. Yeah, it's interesting. You know what, actually, before we get to this Trotsky thing, I would like to read, where is it? This? Yeah. So this is a letter that we got from Roger, who was on the show a couple months ago. And this is him basically ranting about why a lot of people who are kind of like trying to put forward proposals for a communist society really miss the mark in a number of different ways. And I really found this is quite good because I read recently, actually, I read a critique of the fundamental principles because I have been actually trying to find those, right? I'm not just being like, fundamental principles is good, and I will not let anything dissuade me from that. But I read one that seemed to be very disingenuous. And it was basically like, this is not the fundamental principles of everything of a communist society at all, because it doesn't account for kind of like mechanisms of, I suppose, kind of just like demand in any given society. Like, it doesn't account for the logistics of any kind of, you know, so-called like market. It's like, okay, 50 people are asking for new pairs of socks down in this town. How are we going to get them their socks? And they're kind of saying that the fundamental principles never does that. But this email that we got from Roger, I think really clears a lot of that up. It's kind of like a non-issue. And as he says, it kind of does a lot of the reactionaries' work for them, putting forward a criticism like that. So I'm just going to read it because it's so good. He says, while I'm on a rant, I also have a massive problem with all of the planned economy theorists. I don't want to be too hard on them because at least they're trying. But to anybody who's actually in this world, it's like somebody excitedly telling a dentist that they've discovered teeth. Modern capitalist management is so far beyond these theorists that it's really hard to describe, right? And so I think he's kind of talking here about like maybe Paracon people or like, I don't know, various socialist thinkers of the past who have kind of tried to be like, well, how can we do what capitalist markets do now, but do it in a just way when it comes to like responding to demand, right? Because capitalists will always go in theory to where there's demand, right? So then he goes on to say, this is like one of them saying, some logistical problem might throw the whole plan off and require it to all be recalculated. What do they think that logistics managers do all day? It's literally their job to stop things like that from spiraling out of control without needing some massive degree of oversight. More disturbingly, it's like none of the planned economy writers even know that there's such a thing as a pull system. Push is just make stuff and try and sell it. There's a lot of this going on in the Soviet Union. Pull is responding to demand, either specific or predictable. It's like the customer pulls on a chain that pulls their product down the production line. That chain extends up the supply line all the way to the iron ore mine or whatever. All the people up the supply chain know each other, their industry's capabilities, and can coordinate to try and meet demand. Most of the problems of economic planning go away because it's just a part of everyday operations. There was a time when Toyota could deliver a car custom built for you to your house within 5 days. But these planners think a lead time of a year is acceptable to buy a pair of shoes. Guys, stop doing PragerU's work for them. Consumer planning needs to be more like, you want a fridge, here's your fridge, enjoy your fridge. It does not get more complicated if demand is so high, or it does get more complicated if demand is so high that you need to expand capacity, and doing big one-off projects are a separate issue. And in the early days of a socialist society, there'll be so much that needs doing. Demand for almost everything will just be yes. But if you can get the basics to essentially run themselves, you free up massive capacity for the world-changing mega projects, the ones I suspect a lot of us got into this so that we could do one day. And I think that he makes such a good point here. There's so much fucking naysaying on the like Marxist left about planned economies that people just inevitably they go, oh no, this could never work because like what if somebody wants a pair of shoes? You're gonna have to kind of like completely rework the production process to get them their pair of shoes because you only accounted for 5,000 pairs of shoes at this factory. Now somebody wants another pair of shoes, the whole fucking thing's out of whack. But it's just like that's so not true. And I think the criticism of the fundamental principles that was like, where are the shadow prices? How are people accounting for demand? It's just like, it's so disingenuous because capitalists right now, as Roger says here, are operating on such a different level of logistical management that it's just like, it's almost like you have to wonder if some of these people are just ops. I mean, I know that's a really unhealthy attitude to have, but it's like, it isn't an issue even if there's like a brand new demand within a year of 5,000 new pairs of shoes in some region, because it's just like logistical managers will kind of just figure that out. And honestly, I don't see a reason why the fundamental principle stuff, well, I think it would need logistical managers, right? So like, I don't know. The whole point of Roger's email, I guess, is to basically just say it isn't really as crazy as everybody thinks. As long as you're accounting for everything, which is what the fundamental principles does, it's kind of like it's all going to be okay. Like you're going to have people who are able to respond dynamically to demand. And I think that this is why a lot of Marxists kind of just throw up their hands and fall back on like, we just need state capitalism. We just need to like, you know, fall back on a big central plan where there's big input-output matrices and somebody decides how many shoes somebody else gets. But in reality, it's just not necessary. And that criticism that I was reading was basically like, this is more like, instead of fundamental principles, this is more like not all of the fundamental principles of communist production distribution. And it's just like, oh my fucking God, it's just missing the point. It's like reading this book and being like, how will your political structures work? It's like, well, it doesn't get into it. Go read a book about logistical planning if you need to know about like how logistics will work. I don't know. It's very simple. It's a lot more simple than we think. Like, the capitalist production apparatus that hopefully we'll inherit, like, is able to respond to demand really dynamically. And if you have people who are just like logistics managers, it's all going to be fine. And I think that maybe where you could have a bit of a, you know, criticism of the difficulty with logistical planning is, to be fair, because a lot of modern logistical structures are like, and I mean, in terms of transportation, are really outdated. That's kind of the point. Like, so much of the capitalist logistical structure operates on like trucks, which is incredibly inefficient, but that is the purpose. It's because there's so much slack that like capitalists can kind of just get away with like, okay, just leave that, you know, box of TVs there for a little while. There's just so much waste that it's fine. But under socialism, one of these big mega products early on, I would imagine, would be setting up a much more environmentally friendly, ecologically conscious, and efficient transportation structure. And that would probably just look like rail, right? It would just look like a good rail system. And so anyway, my whole point with this stuff is that it is more simple than people think. And that I think that if your criticism of the fundamental principles is, you know, but how will we operate logistics? I don't know. I don't know if that one really flies. I don't know. Because in the same way that capitalists do it now with logistics managers, and you really don't need a system or want a system of like shadow prices to figure everything out. Like, I don't know. That's a bit of the old, what does Marx call it? A bit of the old traditions of dead generations weighing on people like an Alp. It's a bit of that, I think. But, you know, what are you going to do? So, anyway, on a bit of a different note, the last thing I'd like to get to, how do I do this, is this Trotsky speech. And the reason I wanted to read this is basically Trotsky in, when was it? March 9th, 1919. So post-failure of the German Revolution, right? This is him delivering a speech, hopefully, I believe it's at the Comintern, to the members of the German, like, communist left, right? And it's kind of just him hassling Kautsky for reasons that I think will become abundantly clear why I'm bringing this up, because I do think that it relates to a lot of the fundamental principle stuff. Weirdly, because listen, I'm not somebody to like praise Trotsky for any reason at all, but the man knew what he was doing, at least in this when he was talking about Kautsky. So this is kind of like renegade Kautsky stuff, but I do think it's really important. I think I'll just start here. He says, from Kautsky, we have heard that although the conquest of political power by the working class happens to be the historical task of a social democratic party, insomuch as the Russian Communist Party has come to power not through those portals, nor at the time indicated by Kautsky's prescription, the Soviet Republic must therefore be handed over for correction and reform to Kerensky, that guy, and Chernov, right? So this is all basically Trotsky responding to Kautsky's like grumpy, wait a minute, what are the workers doing? They're doing direct action, they're taking things into their own hands. I'm not trying to say that's what the like Bolshevik coup was, but I think that this is kind of a response to a lot of Marxist paternalist teleology of history stuff that you still see today, and I'll get to that here in a sec. So this big paragraph, I would suggest people read this. This big paragraph is basically about why workers shouldn't listen to people like Kautsky. So he says, Kautsky's pedantic reactionary criticism must seem to be the more unexpected to those German comrades who lived consciously through the period of the First Russian Revolution and who read the 1905 to 1906 articles of Kautsky. At that time, Kautsky, no, true, not without Rosa Luxemburg's beneficent influence, thoroughly understood and recognized the Russian Revolution could not be consummated by a bourgeois democratic republic, but because of the level attained by the class struggle within the country and because of the entire international condition of capitalism, must lead to the dictatorship of the working class. So he says that at one point Kautsky kind of got it, right? You know, because of the way that Russia was situated within the International Division of Labor and just with its own quote-unquote like development, you couldn't really wait for like a liberal or even just like social democratic government to come in, do the bourgeois revolution, and then do socialism, right? But he goes on to say, today, when the perspectives outlined 15 years ago have become the reality, Kautsky refuses to issue a certificate of baptism to the Russian Revolution because, and this is the important bit that I want to talk about, because it had not been legally certified by the political department of bourgeois democracy. An astonishing fact. What an incredible debasement of Marxism. One can say with complete justification that the collapse of the Second International finds an even more odious expression in this Philistine attitude of its outstanding theoretician towards the Russian Revolution than it did in the vote cast on August 4th, 1914 in favor of war credits. So, the whole point of this basically is to hassle Kautsky for kind of falling back on this teleological, first you gotta have your bourgeois revolution, and you kind of gotta leave that to, you know, your social democrats or your liberals. Leave it to somebody else. Real revolution from above stuff. And how Kautsky couldn't possibly, you know, take to bear the fact that the working class had, was what Trotsky's saying, taken matters into its own hands in the Russian Revolution and kind of just skipped that bourgeois bit, right? Now, Trotsky's not really one to talk because the Bolshevik coup wasn't really the working class taking, you know, direct action or whatever. There were elements of that, obviously, but like that isn't what it was. It was kind of just a coup. You didn't hear that from me, but it was literally just a coup. But I think that this points to a really important bit that I think ties back to a lot of the reasons I've been wanting to return to the fundamental principles. And it has to do with the email that we got from Mike McNair, not to throw Mike McNair under the bus, but it's like most Marxists, basically all Marxist sects now, are just so stamped with this revolution from above stuff without realizing it. Even if they're like really outwardly against revolution from above, they're really paternalistic in their politics. And the reason for that is because they kind of just think that communism is going to be something that happens once the working class, read the Vanguard, takes control of the state. Somehow, I don't know how the fuck people still think that's going to happen, but somehow that happens, and then they benevolently do socialism, right? It's this idea that, like, you know, most Marxists should know this shit. You can't just take control of the state, smash the Constitution or whatever it is that a lot of socialists think that you can do in the United States, and then just nationalize everything, and then just have socialism. You need to really be thinking about the underlying kind of structure of capitalism and what makes capitalism capitalism. And it is, you know, in a very esoteric way that I wrote down here in a not very clear way, where is it? It's these two things, right? the two things that you need to be focusing on are private ownership of the means of production, how you get rid of that, and how you get rid of production for exchange. Those are what you need to be focusing on. You can't really be focusing on, who's going to take control of the state and then just do socialism somehow or not. That isn't the point of all of your strategy. Needs to begin from these 2 points. It doesn't take them for granted later on, because, to give a lot of these people credit, like, I do think that a lot of modern communists think that once you take control of the state through getting elected or whatever, once you build a mass party or whatever and do communist politics, that you could then go about getting rid of private ownership. They do think that, and production for exchange. But I think because it's kind of like a post facto thing, and that they're thinking that their politics and strategy for politics doesn't begin with these 2 things, it kind of just ends with them, that they're doomed. Because, you need to be thinking about, I don't really have an answer for this, but you need to be thinking about how it is that you can affect this change in capitalism to then get to socialism, right? And if you're able to do it in the way that the fundamental principles people say that you are, and I think that you could have many different strategies for trying to get to that point. Some of them might literally be electoralist. I don't know. That seems kind of crazy to me, but they might be. You can kind of, I guess what I'm saying is you can kind of have the politics that you want, but as long as they don't begin with like an understanding of value, then you're kind of fucked. And because you need to be thinking about where value comes from, what makes capitalism capitalism, which is to say the production of value and accumulation of capital. And then you need to be thinking about, well, how is it that we can actually get past that? And I think that like a lot of the communist politics now take this stuff as a thing that will be solved somewhere down the line by somebody. We just need to take power first. And I think that that's incredibly egotistical, honestly, because it's just like, it's the most revolution from above stuff ever, and it just really doesn't focus on what is actually important in communism, which is getting past this relation of value. So, I don't know. We'll see. I would like to see some more proposals, political proposals, for how we get to this point. But again, I think that there's a reason that the fundamental principles is called the fundamental principles, because I do think that you need to take this stuff as a starting point, right? Whoa, that's way bigger than I thought it would. And if you don't, yeah, you're kind of screwed, honestly, because you don't have an understanding of what makes capitalism capitalism. And if you try to just take political power first and then solve this stuff by like nationalization and state control of things until we can somehow get to a higher stage of production, then, I don't know. It might not work out, just because you're going to wind up doing maybe what the Soviet Union did, which is not actually getting rid of value production. So I think this is just where I keep coming back to with my thinking in terms of like, what are the proposals that will actually get us past capitalism? And I don't know, you can kind of have whatever politics you want, but I think that like the economics is maybe not really as up in the air as people think. There are really only a couple of things that you can do to get rid of value and value production. So I don't know, we'll see. I'm actually going to go because I haven't really eaten dinner. I'm very hungry. But I would like to kind of return to this book again, and I would kind of like to pair it with Isaac Rubin, because I think that, again, any good political strategy begins with an understanding of value and an understanding of how communism can get past value production. So we'll see. I'm going to get going, but I'll see everybody later. If there's anything you'd all like me to talk about on stream, let me know. But until then, Dan and I will be back, not this coming Friday, but the Friday after, with an episode. And we're reading something really good. It's all about religion. It's by a fellow named Gilbert Achcar. I think that's how you pronounce his name. And it's all about a Marxian, as he calls it, critique of religion. And he takes two different strands of modern religious thinking, Islamic fundamentalism on one hand and liberation theology on the other, to kind of compare why it is that the 21st century has seen actually an outgrowth of religious thinking and why that may not be so good. So it's going to be really good. We're going to be talking religion.